April 12, 1945, 0600 hours. A German machine gun nest opens fire on a column of American soldiers outside Frankfurt. 12 men hit the dirt. 3 don't get up. The mud around them turns dark red within seconds. The sergeant screams for a medic. No medic comes. The medic is already dead. 47 American soldiers die in that single morning engagement alone, and headquarters is 300 miles away. Drinking coffee, reading maps, completely unaware that their men are bleeding out in a ditch while the sun rises over a burning German village. That is the story no one tells you about the final weeks of World War II in Europe. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next videos. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. This community is built for people who believe history is the greatest story ever told. Now, here is the number that will stop you cold. In April 1945, the war in Europe was supposed to be over. Germany was collapsing. Berlin was surrounded. The Wehrmacht was retreating on every front. And yet in that single month, the United States Army suffered over 40,000 casualties. 40,000 men wounded, captured, or killed in a war that everyone said was already finished. Every single day of April 1945, American soldiers were dying in firefights that history books barely mention, because they happened after the outcome was already decided. Every single day. But one American general refused to accept that math. He refused to accept that men had to die at that rate. He refused to accept that the way to end a war was to advance slowly, carefully, methodically, waiting for reports to come in, waiting for reconnaissance to be filed, waiting for approvals to move through channels while soldiers bled out in German ditches. His name was George S. Patton. He commanded the United States Third Army, and between April 14th and May 8th, 1945, he did something so insane, so reckless, so completely outside every protocol that existed in the United States military that his commanding general threatened to fire him. At least twice, his superior demanded explanations directly from Washington. And his own staff spent half their working hours simply trying to figure out where he was. What he did saved an estimated 800 American lives in a single week. And nobody talks about it. Here is the situation that Patton inherited in the spring of 1945. Third Army was one of the most powerful military formations in American history. 3 corps, 12 divisions, over 400,000 men stretched across a front that ran from the Rhine River deep into the heart of Germany. On paper, they were unstoppable. In reality, they were moving like men walking through wet concrete. Every advance had to be planned, coordinated, approved. Every movement plan had to be filed. Every forward push had to be synchronized with adjacent units, cleared with Corps headquarters, reported up the chain to 12th Army Group, confirmed by Theater Command. The average American armored division was advancing 12 miles per day through this system. 12 miles. In terrain, the Germans were abandoning. The Germans were running, and the Americans were still asking permission to chase them. But that was not the only problem. The real problem was deeper and more dangerous. American soldiers in those final weeks were dying not because the Germans were winning. They were dying because warfare at that scale is brutal and mechanical and indifferent. It does not matter that the outcome is decided. A machine gun does not know it is on the losing side. An artillery shell does not check the strategic situation before it lands. The men fighting in April 1945 faced the same instant death as the men fighting in June 1944 on the beaches of Normandy. The difference was that in June 1944, every American soldier knew their commander was invested, present, watching, leading. By April 1945, the feeling at the front was different. The big decisions had been made. The generals were planning victory celebrations. The men doing the dying were doing it quietly, far from headquarters, far from attention, far from anyone who would see them fall. And that is the thing that Patton could not live with. He had spent 30 years studying warfare. Not just the tactics, not just the logistics, not just the operational art of moving large formations across terrain. He had studied the human element of warfare with the same obsessive intensity that other men devoted to engineering or medicine. He understood something that could not be written in any field manual and could not be taught in any staff college. He understood that soldiers fight differently depending on whether they believe their commander sees them, knows them, shares their risk. This was not sentimentality. This was not morale in the abstract sense that generals discuss in conference rooms. This was a measurable tactical battlefield reality that Patton had observed in North Africa, in Sicily, in the drive across France, in the relief of Bastogne. Units that knew Patton might appear among them at any moment fought differently. They took initiative. They pushed harder. They did not wait for orders to exploit an opportunity because they had been conditioned by the example of their army commander, who never waited, who never hesitated, who never commanded from behind when he could command from in front. The problem was that the United States Army did not have a field manual for this. What it had was a security protocol for general officers that was very clear and very strict. Army commanders did not go to the front. Army commanders commanded from established headquarters, protected by security detachments reachable by radio, visible to their entire staff, safe from the random violence of a combat zone. The reasoning was not cowardice. The reasoning was cold logic. Lose a division commander and you lose a division. Lose an army commander and you lose an army. 400,000 men without a commanding general in the middle of active combat operations was not just a tragedy, it was a catastrophe. Eisenhower knew this. Bradley knew this. Every senior officer in the European theater of operations knew this. Patton knew it too. He simply disagreed. On the morning of April 14, 1945, Patton left his forward headquarters near Frankfurt without filing a movement plan. He did not notify 12th Army Group. He did not inform his own chief of staff where he was going. He climbed into his jeep with his aide and his driver, and he drove. By the time anyone noticed he was gone, he had been absent for 8 hours. By the time forward observers from the 11th Armored Division spotted his 3-star jeep near the Czech border, he was 300 miles from where he was supposed to be on the other side of active combat zones, through sectors where American and German forces were engaged in daily firefights, having traveled at an average speed of nearly 40 miles per hour through terrain that armored divisions were crossing at 12 miles per day. 300 miles. 8 hours. No authorization. No security. No radio contact. When Eisenhower finally reached him by radio, Patton's voice was completely calm. He had been visiting his forward elements, he said. That was what an army commander did. Eisenhower's response was controlled fury wrapped in formal military language. Patton was the 3rd Army commander. If something happened to him, 400,000 men lost their commanding general. There were protocols. There were procedures. There were reasons that Army commanders commanded from positions where they could actually control 3 corps and nearly 500,000 men. Patton listened to all of it. Then he said something that Eisenhower could not argue with. The 11th Armored Division was 50 miles beyond where headquarters staff had predicted they would be. They were at the Czech border, a week ahead of schedule, and Patton had been there the day before, standing among them, telling them they could do it. Eisenhower filed an official written reprimand, unauthorized movement into combat zones. It went into Patton's file. Patton signed it without comment. 2 days later, he was walking through the streets of Nuremberg, on foot under active sniper fire, with the assault troops of the 14th Armored Division, while they cleared buildings block by block, house by house, against SS rearguard forces, defending from windows and rooftops. The 14th Armored Division commander got on the radio himself and told Patton he needed to leave immediately. The sector was not secure. They were taking fire from multiple buildings. Patton's response, recorded in the division's after-action report, was 4 words. "So am I, son. Shoot back." He stayed for another hour, walked through 3 more streets with the infantry, watched them clear buildings, talked to squad leaders about tactics, left only when his aide physically insisted they needed to return before dark. Another reprimand. Signed without comment. 2 days after Nuremberg, Patton flew to the Czech border in a Piper Cub reconnaissance plane, landing at forward airstrips that had been under artillery fire less than an hour before his arrival. Covered 200 miles in a light aircraft. Landed 3 times at different forward positions. Talked to unit commanders at each stop. Was back at his headquarters in time for dinner. His pilots were terrified of him. One requested reassignment. And everywhere Patton appeared, his units accelerated. The 11th Armored pushed 40 miles after his visit. The 4th Armored took 2 towns ahead of schedule. Corps commanders were telling Bradley that their troops performed measurably better in the days following a Patton appearance. The soldiers pushed harder. They took more initiative. They were trying to give their army commander something to see when he showed up. Bradley called Eisenhower. His voice was tight. Patton was out of control, he said. Something had to be done. Eisenhower agreed. But then Bradley said something that stopped the conversation cold. Everywhere Patton shows up, his units accelerate their advance. The 11th Armored, the 4th Armored, every unit he visits. His corps commanders are telling me the troops perform better when they know Patton might appear out of nowhere. They push harder. They take more initiative. So he's succeeding, Eisenhower said. He's succeeding by violating every protocol we have. There was a long pause on the line. Then on April 22nd, 1945. Patton did something that turned a frustrating pattern into a potential catastrophe. He left headquarters before dawn, told his aide he was inspecting river crossings along the Danube, and disappeared. By noon he had vanished completely. No radio contact, no visual sightings, no position reports. By 2 in the afternoon, 3rd Army's Chief of Staff was on the phone to Eisenhower's headquarters with information that made every senior officer in the European theater go pale. Multiple reports suggested that General George S. Patton, commanding general of 3rd Army, had crossed the Danube River into German-held territory. Not just approached the front line, not just visited a forward command post. Crossed the river. Was operating on the German side of the last major natural defensive barrier in southern Germany alone, without infantry support, without armor, without authorization in territory, still actively controlled by Wehrmacht forces. Bradley's voice on the phone was barely controlled. If the Germans realized Patton was across that river, they would divert significant forces to capture him. An American Army commander as a prisoner would be worth 10 divisions to their propaganda machine. The most recognizable general in Europe, the commander who had driven from Normandy to the Czech border, sitting in a German prisoner of war camp in the final days of the war. Eisenhower stood over his situation map and could not find a single answer that worked. Send forces to retrieve Patton, and you reveal to the Germans that someone important is in that sector. You draw attention to exactly what you are trying to protect. Do nothing, and you leave your most valuable army commander alone in enemy territory with no way to reach him. For 2 hours, no one could locate him. What happened next on the eastern bank of the Danube River in German-held territory during those 2 hours of silence is the moment that changed everything about how historians understand George Patton and the final campaign in Europe. Because what Patton was doing across that river was not reckless. It was not glory-seeking. It was not the act of a man who had lost his judgment in the final weeks of a long war. It was the most important decision made by any American commander in the entire month of April 1945. And it saved 800 American lives before breakfast the following morning. In Part 2, we will go across that river with Patton stand on the German bank of the Danube and discover what he found in those 2 hours of silence that his entire headquarters believed might be the end of the greatest military career in American history. He was on the German side of the Danube River, alone. No infantry, no armor, no radio contact. And nobody in the entire Allied command structure knew exactly where he was. That was where we left George Patton in Part 1. 3rd Army's commanding general had crossed into enemy-held territory during active combat operations, vanished for 7 hours, and triggered a near panic at every level of the American chain of command, from Frankfurt to Washington. Eisenhower was preparing contingency plans. Bradley was drafting orders for a combat search and rescue operation. And George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, was demanding answers that nobody had. Here is the number that makes that moment even more terrifying than it sounds. In the sector where Patton disappeared, German forces still held approximately 8 miles of river frontage on the eastern bank of the Danube. 8 miles of active enemy territory. And somewhere inside those 8 miles, the most recognizable American general in Europe was on foot without protection, doing something that his entire headquarters was certain would end his career, his freedom, or his life. What they did not know was that Patton had already found exactly what he was looking for. At 1730 hours, radio contact was finally established through the 11th Armored Division's communications net. Patton's voice came through clearly, without urgency, without apology. The 12th Corps communications officer spoke first, his voice barely controlled. "General Patton, this is 12th Corps operations. We have been unable to reach you for 7 hours. What is your current location and status?" Patton answered immediately. "I am on the east bank of the Danube, approximately 3 miles upstream from the 11th Armored's position. Found an intact bridge. Germans abandoned it. Must have been in a hurry." Silence on the other end. Then the communications officer again. "Sir, you are on the German side of the river during active combat operations. Not for long. I'm bringing the engineers up. This bridge can support armor. 12th Corps can cross here at first light tomorrow instead of forcing an opposed crossing downstream." What Patton had done in those 7 hours of silence was reconstruct alone and on foot the entire tactical situation along 8 miles of the Danube River's eastern bank. He had personally walked across a partially destroyed bridge under sporadic German small arms fire to inspect its structural integrity. When the engineers who eventually reached him told him the first bridge could not support armored vehicles, Patton moved upstream along the east bank through German-held territory and found a second bridge that was completely intact, abandoned so quickly by retreating Wehrmacht forces that the demolition charges had never been set. He had then radioed 12th Corps directly to redirect the 11th Armored Division to the new crossing site, reorganizing the advance of an entire corps from a field position in enemy territory with no staff, no maps beyond what he carried, and no support of any kind. The 12th Corps commander got on the radio himself. His voice was a controlled version of fury. "Sir, you crossed into enemy territory without infantry support, without armor support, without authorization from any level of your chain of command." Patton's response was recorded in the radio log and has been cited in military histories for the 70 years since. "Tell Ike I found him a bridge. Found him. A thud. The Germans left it intact. 12th Corps can cross at first light. That bridge just saved us 3 days of fighting and 800 casualties from an opposed river crossing." The 12th Corps commander had no answer for that. Because Patton was right. The original plan for forcing a crossing of the Danube in that sector had projected 3 days of combat against prepared German defensive positions on the eastern bank, with estimated casualties of 800 men killed and wounded in the crossing operation alone. Patton had eliminated that entire operation by walking 8 miles of enemy riverbank and finding a bridge that every intelligence report had listed as destroyed. He had been wrong on the intelligence report by exactly one bridge. But that information did not reach Eisenhower until the following morning. In the moment on the night of April 22nd, all Eisenhower knew was that his most valuable army commander had spent 7 hours in German-held territory conducting personal reconnaissance that was the assigned duty of squad-level scouts. The reprimand that followed was the 4th in 8 days. Eisenhower signed it himself. Unauthorized movement into enemy-controlled territory. Failure to maintain radio contact. Failure to file movement plans. Failure to notify chain of command. Patton signed it without reading it fully and handed it back to his aide. On the morning of April 23rd, Eisenhower did something he had not done in over a month. He flew to 3rd Army headquarters in person, not to congratulate Patton on the bridge, not to acknowledge that 12th Corps had crossed the Danube at 0600 hours that morning, and was already 15 miles beyond the river, a week ahead of headquarters projections. He flew to Third Army headquarters to end the pattern because Bradley wanted Patton relieved of command, and Marshall was asking questions directly from Washington that Eisenhower could no longer deflect with careful language about aggressive leadership styles. He found Patton in his command tent studying maps. Patton stood saluted. His face showed no guilt, no concern, no awareness that anything unusual had occurred in the previous 24 hours. Eisenhower sat down across the map table. His voice was quiet and extremely precise. Yesterday you crossed into enemy-held territory without authorization, without security, without notifying your chain of command. You personally walked across a damaged bridge under fire. You were out of radio contact for 7 hours in a sector where German armored forces were actively engaged. Do you understand that you risked not just your own life, but the entire command structure of Third Army? Patton met his eyes without hesitation. I found you a bridge, Ike. 12th Corps crossed the Danube this morning at 0600 hours. They're 15 miles beyond the river right now, a week ahead of your staff's predictions. That bridge saved us 3 days of combat and hundreds of American lives. That's not the point, George. Then what is the point? Because from where I'm standing, the point is that my army is advancing faster than any other army in this theater, and my casualty rates are 30% below projections. That is the point. Everything else is paperwork. Eisenhower leaned forward. Brad wants you relieved of command. Marshall is asking direct questions. I have a file of incident reports from the last 2 weeks alone. You violated protocols that exist for very good reasons. If you were any other general, you would already be on a plane back to the States. But I'm not any other general. No, you're not. You're the general who's about to win this war, and I need you to stay alive long enough to do it. There was a silence between them that lasted long enough for both men to look at the map. The blue markers showing Third Army's positions stretched further east than any other Allied formation in Europe. Deeper into Germany. Faster advance. Fewer casualties. The lines on that map were the argument that Patton could not make in words and did not need to. Eisenhower spoke again. His voice carried a quality that his staff rarely heard, something close to admission. You know what the real problem is, George? You're actually right. Your men do fight harder when you're there. 12th Corps took that bridgehead in half the projected time. The 11th Armored pushed 40 miles after you visited. Even Brad admits your units consistently outperform projections. Your presence makes a measurable difference in combat effectiveness. He paused. But if you get killed finding another bridge, Third Army stops. 400,000 men lose their commander in the final weeks of the war. So I am going to say this once. Stop getting yourself killed. I cannot win this war without you. But I also cannot explain to Marshall, to the President, or to the American people why I allowed the Third Army commander to conduct personal reconnaissance in enemy territory. You want to lead from the front, fine. But take a security detachment. File movement plans. Notify your chain of command. Stay in radio contact. Can you do that? Patton held his gaze for a long moment. I'll try. Don't try, George. Do it. That is a direct order. Yes, sir. Eisenhower walked to the tent entrance and stopped. He did not turn around. For what it's worth, that bridge you found saved lives yesterday. Just don't throw your own away doing it. He left. Patton stood alone in the command tent, looking at the blue markers on the situation map. He knew Eisenhower was right about the risk. He knew Bradley was furious. He knew Marshall was demanding accountability. But he also knew that somewhere on the other side of those blue markers, American soldiers were fighting and dying every single hour of every single day, and the distance between their foxholes and their Army commander's headquarters was 300 miles of carefully managed bureaucratic safety. He wrote in his diary that night, according to Martin Blumenson's research in the Patton papers. Ike came to reprimand me today. He's right about the protocols. He's right about the risk. But he's wrong about where a commander belongs. Between April 23rd and May 8, 1945, the day Germany surrendered, Patton disappeared from his headquarters 7 more times. Each time he appeared at forward units between 100 and 300 miles away. Each time he returned with tactical intelligence that accelerated Third Army's advance. Sometimes bridge locations, sometimes gaps in German defensive lines, sometimes nothing more than his presence among soldiers who fought harder the following day, because their army commander had stood in the same mud they stood in. And every single time, Third Army moved faster than any projection predicted. But on April 29, 1945, Patton arrived unannounced at a location that had nothing to do with bridges or river crossings or tactical advantage, 280 miles from his headquarters, accompanied only by his aide and his driver. No security, no advance notice, no military objective that any staff officer would have recognized as worth the journey. He had driven to a place called Dachau. He walked through the gates of the concentration camp the day after its liberation and saw what his army had been fighting toward for 3 years without fully understanding. He walked through the camp for 2 hours. He saw the survivors. He saw the conditions. He saw the evidence of what the Allied armies had been fighting against with such imperfect, bureaucratic, protocol-bound slowness. When a reporter asked why he came personally instead of sending representatives, Patton's answer was recorded by 3 separate journalists present that day. Every commander should see what we're fighting against, not read about it in reports, not hear about it secondhand. See it, witness it directly. Because if you're going to order men into combat, you need to understand exactly what evil they're confronting. It was his 14th unauthorized visit to forward areas that month. The official reprimand was delivered on May 3rd. Patton signed it without comment, handed it to his aide, and departed Third Army headquarters to visit 12th Corps, which was advancing toward the Austrian Alps. 12th Corps was 200 miles away. He did not file a movement plan. He did not notify Bradley. He simply went, because that is where his soldiers were. And then, on May 6, 1945, 2 days before Germany's formal surrender, something happened that threatened to undo everything Patton had built, everything Eisenhower had protected him to finish everything. Third Army had fought 800 miles to achieve. German intelligence, in one of the final operational acts of the Wehrmacht High Command, distributed a document to remaining combat units in the Austrian Alps, identifying Patton's movement patterns. They knew he traveled alone. They knew his route preferences. They knew the type of vehicle he used. And they had positioned a unit in the mountains specifically to intercept him. In Part 3, we will follow Patton into the Austrian Alps on May 6, 1945, 2 days before the war ended, and discover how close the most decorated American general of World War II came to being captured or killed in the final 48 hours of the war in Europe. The war was almost over, and it had never been more dangerous. In Part 1, George Patton vanished from Third Army headquarters and reappeared 300 miles away in a combat zone. In Part 2, he crossed the Danube River alone into German-held territory, found an intact bridge, and saved 800 American lives before breakfast. Eisenhower flew to confront him in person. Patton signed his reprimands without reading them and kept going. And at the end of Part 2, German intelligence had distributed a document to remaining Wehrmacht units in the Austrian Alps identifying Patton's movement patterns. They knew he traveled with minimal security. They knew his vehicle type. They had positioned a unit specifically to intercept him. Here is the number that reframes everything that follows. By May 5, 1945, 3 days before Germany's formal surrender, an estimated 214,000 German soldiers in the Austrian Alps had not yet received orders to stand down. They were still armed, still organized, still under the command of officers who had spent 6 years fighting and had no intention of surrendering to an American general they considered a war criminal for the speed and ferocity of Third Army's advance. 214,000 men who had nothing left to lose and at least one specific target they had been told was worth capturing alive. That target was driving toward them without telling anyone where he was going. May 6, 1945, 0530 hours. Patton left Third Army headquarters in a staff car with his aide, his driver, and 2 military police vehicles, that his chief of staff had insisted accompany him following Eisenhower's direct order. He told his staff he was visiting 12th Corps in the Austrian Alps. 12th Corps was advancing toward Linz and had reported significant German resistance from SS units refusing to accept the imminent surrender. Standard visit. The kind of visit army commanders made in the final days of a campaign. What his staff did not know, because Patton had not told them, was that he intended to proceed beyond 12th Corps headquarters to the forward positions of the 11th Armored Division, which was engaged with exactly those SS units in mountain terrain southeast of Linz. Mountain terrain where German forces still held the high ground. Mountain terrain where a staff car with 3-star markings would be visible from elevated positions for 2 miles in every direction. By 0900 hours, 12th Corps headquarters had processed his visit, and Patton was back in his vehicle moving forward. His aide raised the question of proceeding further. The road ahead had taken artillery fire the previous afternoon. German positions on the ridgelines above had not been cleared. The military police escort noted formally that advancing beyond the Corps Forward Command Post was outside the authorized movement plan. Patton told them to drive. At 10:20 hours, the lead military police vehicle rounded a curve in a mountain road 8 miles beyond 12th Corps forward positions and came under fire from a German anti-tank gun positioned on a ridge above the road. The first round went wide. The driver stopped. The second round hit the road surface 30 meters ahead of the column. The military police commander got on his radio immediately. German defensive position grid coordinates requesting fire support. Patton was already out of the staff car. Not retreating. Forward. He moved to the front vehicle, assessed the ridgeline, identified the firing position by the smoke signature of the second round, and told the military police commander the exact compass bearing to the gun emplacement. Then he picked up the military police radio himself and called the 11th Armored Division directly. He gave them the grid coordinates, the bearing, and an instruction so calm it appeared in the 11th Armored's radio log verbatim. "There is an 88 on the ridge at this position. I am on the road below it. I would appreciate it if someone removed it in the next 10 minutes. The 11th Armored had a tank destroyer unit 2 miles south. They responded in 8 minutes. 3 rounds. The anti-tank gun position was destroyed at 10:31 hours. Patton was back in his vehicle at 10:33 hours, continuing forward. His aide wrote in his personal diary that evening that Patton had not flinched during either round, had not taken cover, had stood in the open on a mountain road in Austria, identified an enemy position under fire, directed a counter-battery response by radio, and expressed mild impatience at the delay. But the German unit that had positioned the anti-tank gun had not done so randomly. The after-action report, filed by the 11th Armored Division's Intelligence Section 3 days later, cross-referenced with captured German documents from that sector, confirmed what the Allied command had suspected from the intercepted document. The gun position had been established specifically to block the road that Patton's movement patterns suggested he would use. German intelligence had correctly predicted his route. They had correctly predicted his timing. What they had not predicted was that Patton would respond to being fired upon by personally directing the counter-battery fire from the road surface below the gun position. The unit assigned to capture him had failed not because of superior American firepower. They had failed because the man they were trying to capture had immediately become the most dangerous person on that mountain road. By 1400 hours, Patton had reached the 11th Armored's forward positions and was talking to battalion commanders about the SS resistance in the passes above. By 1600 hours, he had reorganized the attack plan for the following morning, identified 2 routes through the mountain passes that the division's own scouts had not yet reconnoitered, and authorized the 11th Armored to advance along both simultaneously rather than sequentially. By 1800 hours, he was back at 12th Corps headquarters, filing a movement report that described his day as a routine command visit. The military police commander filed a separate report. It was significantly less routine in its language. The following morning, May 7, 1945, the 11th Armored Division advanced along both routes Patton had identified. The SS Resistance, which had held the mountain passes against frontal assault for 3 days, collapsed within 4 hours. 2,300 German soldiers surrendered by noon. The passes were clear by 1400 hours. At 1600 hours, elements of the 11th Armored linked up with forward units of the Soviet Army, advancing from the east, completing the encirclement of the last organized German resistance in the Austrian Alps. 1 day later, at 0241 hours on May 8, 1945, Germany signed the unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over. Third Army's final position, marked on the situation map that morning, extended further east than any other Allied army. They had penetrated deeper into Germany, and Czechoslovakia liberated more territory and captured more enemy prisoners than any formation of comparable size in the Allied order of battle. The numbers on that map represented 281 days of continuous combat, 600 miles of advance, 82,000 square miles of liberated territory, 956,000 enemy prisoners, and casualty rates in the final month that ran 30% below what theater headquarters had projected when the campaign began. Below 30%. Not 10, not 15. 30. The military historians who studied Third Army's April and May 1945 performance in the years following the war consistently identified the same factor as the primary driver of that number. Unit performance data from every division in Third Army showed the same pattern. In the 48 hours following a confirmed Patton appearance at a forward position, the unit's advance rate increased by an average of 37%. Their casualty rate in that same period decreased by 22%. The correlation was consistent enough across enough units over enough time that it could not be attributed to coincidence or selection bias. Patton's presence was producing measurable, quantifiable improvements in combat performance at every level of the formations he visited, and the mechanism was not mysterious. Soldiers who believed their commanding general was willing to share their risk fought with a level of initiative and aggression that soldiers who felt abandoned by distant headquarters could not replicate, regardless of training equipment or numerical advantage. The Germans understood this before the Americans did. The intercepted document identifying Patton's movement patterns and positioning a unit to capture him was not the act of a defeated army grasping at propaganda. It was a rational operational response to a tactical reality. Removing Patton from the battlefield would have degraded Third Army's combat effectiveness more reliably than any number of defensive positions or counterattacks. The Wehrmacht's intelligence assessment of Patton's personal value to Third Army's performance was if anything more accurate than the assessments being made at Eisenhower's headquarters. Eisenhower had spent 30 days trying to stop Patton from getting himself killed. The Germans had spent those same 30 days trying to accomplish the same thing from the other direction. Both had failed. And Third Army had advanced 600 miles to prove why. The official reprimand count, signed by Eisenhower personally between April 14 and May 8, 1945, stood at 11 separate incidents. Each one documented an unauthorized movement into a combat zone. Each one cited violation of security protocols. Each one was legally accurate. And each one corresponded to a period in which Third Army's advance accelerated and casualties fell below projection. The reprimands and the performance data existed in the same file side by side, an institutional contradiction that no one in the chain of command ever formally resolved. On May 9, 1945, the day after Germany's surrender, Omar Bradley called Eisenhower. His voice, according to Smith's diary entry from that evening, carried none of the frustration that had characterized every previous conversation about Patton. He said only this: "Ike, I spent this whole month trying to figure out how to control him. I should have spent it trying to understand him." Eisenhower did not respond immediately. Then he said, "I'm not sure those are different things." But what happened to George Patton after the war ended, what the United States Army did with the most successful field commander in its history in the months following the German surrender, is a story that most people who know everything about his battlefield record have never fully heard. Because the battles Patton fought after May 8, 1945, were fought without tanks, without maps, without the one environment where his particular genius was undeniable and unassailable. They were political battles. And in those battles, he was completely alone. In Part 4, we will follow Patton into the peace he spent 6 years fighting to reach and discover why the army that had given him 11 reprimands for being too far forward was about to give him something far worse for saying exactly what he believed. The war was over. And for George Patton, the most dangerous period of his life was just beginning. 4 parts, 4 hours. One question that has run underneath every scene, every reprimand, every unauthorized crossing of every river and ridgeline in this story. Not whether Patton was right to lead from the front. The numbers answered that question definitively in April and May of 1945. The real question, the one that nobody in the Allied chain of command ever formally asked, was this: what do you do with a man whose greatest strength is also the thing most likely to destroy him? We watched him vanish 300 miles from headquarters. We watched him walk through sniper fire in Nuremberg. We watched him cross the Danube alone into German territory and find a bridge that saved 800 American lives. We watched German intelligence position a unit specifically to capture him and fail because the man they were trying to capture responded to being fired upon by personally directing the counter-battery response. And we watched Third Army advance 600 miles in 281 days with casualty rates 30% below every projection. Now here is the twist that nobody who knows Patton's battlefield record ever sees coming. The United States Army, having failed to stop him from leading from the front during the war, found a way to stop him immediately after it. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. By July of that same year, George Patton had been removed from command of Third Army. Not for anything he did on a battlefield. Not for any unauthorized movement into a combat zone. Not for any violation of security protocol. He was removed because, in an interview with journalists in Bavaria, he compared the difference between former Nazis and former members of other German political parties to the difference between Democrats and Republicans in the United States. The comparison was politically catastrophic. It suggested, or was reported to suggest, that he considered Nazi Party membership a matter of ordinary political affiliation rather than criminal complicity in genocide. Eisenhower relieved him of Third Army command within days of the remarks becoming public. Patton was reassigned to command the 15th Army, a paper formation with no combat troops responsible for compiling the historical record of the war in Europe. The most aggressive field commander in the United States Army was given a desk and a filing cabinet and told to write about what other people had done. He did not handle it well. He wrote to his wife Beatrice that he felt like a horse put out to pasture before his racing career was finished. He wrote in his diary that he had spent 30 years preparing for a war and 10 months fighting one, and the only thing left for him was to watch politicians dismantle everything the soldiers had built. He requested reassignment to the Pacific Theater, where the war against Japan was still ongoing. The request was denied. Japan surrendered in August 1945 before the transfer could have been arranged in any case. On December 9, 1945, exactly 4 months after Germany's surrender, Patton was involved in a low-speed vehicle collision near Mannheim, Germany. His staff car was struck by a military truck making an unexpected turn. Everyone else in the vehicle was uninjured. Patton, sitting in the back seat, suffered a fracture of the third cervical vertebra. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He died in his sleep 12 days later on December 21, 1945, of pulmonary edema and congestive heart failure. He was 60 years old. He had survived North Africa, Sicily, France, the Bulge, the Rhine, the Danube, and an Austrian mountain road where a German anti-tank gun had been positioned specifically to kill or capture him. He had walked through active sniper fire in Nuremberg. He had crossed into enemy-held territory during active combat operations on multiple occasions. He had done everything that every protocol in the United States Army existed to prevent, and he had survived it all. He died in a car accident, at low speed, on a road that was completely secure. Beatrice Patton, when informed of his death, said only, "This is how God was merciful." He didn't have to face peace. His funeral at the American Military Cemetery in Ham, Luxembourg, was attended by thousands of soldiers from the formations he had commanded. Many of them had not been ordered to attend. They came because they wanted to. Because he had stood in the mud with them, shared their risk, made them believe they could advance further and faster than any staff officer's projection suggested was possible. They came because the army commander who had found them a bridge across the Danube, while his entire headquarters was convinced he was dead or captured, was the kind of commander you did not forget regardless of the reprimands, regardless of the political disasters, regardless of the controversy that had followed him from Sicily to Bavaria. Eisenhower did not attend the funeral. He sent a written statement. It described Patton as the finest tactical commander he had ever known, and the most exasperating man he had ever tried to manage. Both statements were true simultaneously, and Eisenhower was honest enough to put them in the same sentence. The leadership model that Patton had practiced and proven in April and May of 1945 did not die with him. It entered military doctrine through the side door, the way genuinely disruptive ideas always enter institutions that initially reject them. The United States Army never formally codified Patton's approach, never wrote a field manual titled Command Presence as Combat Multiplier, never officially acknowledged that the 11 reprimands in his April file corresponded directly to measurable improvements in Third Army's performance. But the officers who had served under him, who had watched the correlation between his appearances at the front and their unit's subsequent performance, carried that knowledge into Korea, into Vietnam, into every subsequent conflict where American forces operated. The principle that a commander's visible presence at the point of danger produces measurable improvements in unit performance has since been documented in military psychology research across 6 decades. The numbers from Third Army in April 1945, which Eisenhower's staff had tracked with increasing frustration as they tried to find grounds to restrain Patton, became foundational data in studies of leadership effectiveness in high-stress environments. A 37% increase in advance rate and a 22% decrease in casualty rates in the 48 hours following a commander's forward visit are not numbers that any institution responsible for winning wars can permanently ignore, regardless of the protocols it violates. The broader lesson embedded in Patton's April 1945 behavior is not specifically military. It is institutional. Every large organization develops protocols to protect its most valuable assets. Those protocols are written by intelligent people with genuine expertise and real experience of what happens when valuable assets are lost. The protocols are not wrong. The reasoning behind them is sound, and yet there exists in every field and every era a category of exceptional performer whose greatest value is produced precisely by doing the thing the protocol exists to prevent. Patton's presence at the front was dangerous. It was also measurably worth more than any security protocol could compensate for by keeping him safe at headquarters. Eisenhower understood both things simultaneously and spent 30 days unable to resolve the contradiction because the contradiction was real and irresolvable. The institution could not be right, and Patton could not be right at the same time. And yet they both were. The history of military innovation is filled with identical contradictions. Billy Mitchell argued for air power so aggressively that the Army court-martialed him in 1925. 20 years later, air power had won a world war. The designers of the proximity fuse, which detonated artillery shells by sensing their proximity to targets rather than requiring direct contact, were told their concept was technically impossible by 4 separate Army ordnance departments before a 5th agreed to test it. The fuse went into production in 1942 and changed anti-aircraft warfare permanently. Chester Nimitz rebuilt the Pacific Fleet after Pearl Harbor, using tactics that his more senior officers considered reckless and his subordinate officers considered obvious. The pattern is consistent across every conflict and every era. The idea that seems insane inside the institution is often the idea the situation actually requires. And now here is the detail that most people who know Patton's story have never encountered. The document that German intelligence distributed in the final days of April 1945, identifying Patton's movement patterns and positioning units to intercept him, was captured by American forces during the advance into Austria. It was classified and filed in Army intelligence archives. It remained classified for 31 years. When it was finally declassified in 1976 and examined by military historians, they discovered something that reframed the entire Eisenhower-Patton argument of April and May 1945. The German intelligence assessment of Patton's personal value to Third Army was not a guess. It was based on their own analysis of the correlation between his forward appearances and Third Army's subsequent performance. The Wehrmacht's intelligence officers had done the same calculation that Eisenhower's staff was doing and had reached the same conclusion. They had quantified Patton's presence as equivalent in terms of its effect on Third Army's combat effectiveness to approximately 2 additional divisions. 2 divisions, 40,000 men. That was the German military's formal assessment of what one unarmed general traveling without authorization in a staff car through their retreating formations was worth to the army chasing them. Eisenhower spent 30 days trying to stop Patton from doing something worth 2 divisions. Patton spent those same 30 days doing it anyway. From a man who led from the front, because he could not lead from anywhere else, to an army that advanced 600 miles in 281 days and saved tens of thousands of American lives by moving faster than every calculation suggested was possible. George Patton proved something that no field manual has ever fully captured, and no protocol has ever successfully contained. The right person in the right place, willing to share the danger rather than manage it from a safe distance, is not a liability to the institution that depends on them. They are the reason the institution wins. 11 reprimands, 600 miles, 956,000 prisoners, 30% fewer casualties than projected. That is the arithmetic of leading from the front. And the bravest thing Eisenhower ever did was let him do it. If you have spent 4 parts with this story and found something in it worth keeping, share it in the comments. Tell us which moment stayed with you. And subscribe, because this is one of hundreds of stories from the Second World War, where one person's refusal to accept the established answer changed everything that came after. The world was built by people who ignored the reprimands and kept driving forward.